This is Jeremy Bassetti, and you're listening to Travel Writing World, a podcast featuring interviews with travel writers about their work and about the business and craft of travel writing. You can find the episode show notes, free travel writing resources, and much more at travelwritingworld.com. When Indian journalist Taran Khan arrived in Kabul in 2006, she imagined it as a homecoming, a return to the land from where her Pashtun ancestors came. Falling in with poets, doctors, and other journalists, she began exploring the city on foot and discovered a Kabul quite different from the one she had encountered in the world's media. Taran Khan joins me today to talk about her new book, Shadow City, which just won the Stanford Dolman Travel Book of the Year award. This interview was recorded several weeks before the announcement. Taran, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
And congratulations on your Stanford Dolman Travel Writing Award nomination. That's a great nod there.
Yes, I'm really happy to be in this really incredible shortlist. I think the books on it look so really, really interesting, and they're so diverse. I love the fact that there's women writers, there's writers from diverse backgrounds. So I feel like it's a great honor to be on this list.
Mm-hmm. And your book is one of the interesting ones on the list as well. You've written a lovely book called Shadow City, A Woman Walks Kabul, and it's a deep and rich book. First, why don't you just tell us a little bit about this new book of yours?
Sure. It's my first book, and it's about, as you said, it's called Shadow City, A Woman Walks Kabul, and it's essentially a story about the city of Kabul. I started going to Afghanistan for the first time in 2006, and I'm a journalist, and at that time, Afghanistan was very much in the news because in 2001, the Taliban had been overthrown, and the NATO forces led by the United States were there, and it seemed to be a time of really incredible change going on. I got the opportunity to go there with my husband and another friend. We were teaching video production at a small channel run by the Afghan government. And we spent a really, really incredible time there, met so many interesting people, and the energy of the city at that time was quite electric. I think there were people doing a lot of interesting work despite having a lot of obstacles. And I and my husband both just really fell in love with the city. We made really good friends, and we tried to go back as often as we could. So we made different journeys to Kabul from 2006 to 2013 was the last time I was there. And the book essentially covers this period in my life and in the life of the city. So the arc of the book overall, if you see, is about 5 years after the Taliban had been removed from power. And 2013 was a year before the NATO forces were to formally end their combat operations in the country. Of course, it played out very differently, but at that time, 2014 was supposed to be the end of this narrative arc. And so that's essentially the time I saw the city, and I feel like I had a window into this time of great flux, a time of great change, and so that is the period the book covers.
Mm-hmm. So from this period, from 2006 to 2013, when you returned to Kabul, was this in the capacity of doing video production work, or did you return under different circumstances?
It was always to do some kind of a similar project. It would always be for media training broadly. But I'm also a journalist, and I was writing the whole time I was there. I would write for different publications, mostly in India. And so essentially, when I began writing the book, I was actually becoming slightly frustrated with how I would see the city and how I would write the city. I felt there was a lag in between these two cities that I was, essentially inhabiting. And even within the format of feature writing, even if it was a sort of a slightly longer canvas to work with, I felt the most interesting things that I would see in Kabul were the things that I wouldn't write about. And so I started writing slightly more, I wouldn't say experimental, but just, pieces that looked at the stuff that I thought was, really, which moved me, or which I felt was giving a sense of what it felt like to be in Kabul. And from there, it started to grow. I think I saw the potential for a book that took this approach.
I see. We tend to think of Afghanistan as a desolate a place, geographically, and maybe some think desolate culturally or historically. Yet, the opposite is true. And Kabul is at a crossroads of sorts and has this like deep, complicated history, some of which you touch on in the book. But what captured me here was not how deep and rich Kabul was, but how deep and rich Kabul is. And you write of libraries and cinemas and weddings and salons, and you talk about all of these kind of rich layers of life in Kabul. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk about this and also tell us why you call your book Shadow City.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really great, interesting observation because, as you say, there is a sense of barrenness, I think, in the imagination when. Which I include myself in. And when I went to Kabul for the first time, I hadn't conceived of it as a city of, I would say, nuance. And at that time, my main frame of reference was before the Taliban and after the Taliban, and it was extremely black and white. And one of the most important things I learned over the time I spent in Kabul was that how extremely different reality is from this perception that we have of the city. And that makes sense because it is a city. And I think this was what I found really interesting the more time I spent in Kabul was the sense of distance, the conceptual distance that we tend to take from this place. It seems like very often I'd be asked, so what is it like there? And in that framing and that tone of the question would be an inherent sense of distance, as if it's a city which you cannot conceive of or you cannot imagine inhabiting. Whereas actually, of course, everyday life does go on in the city, along with tracks of war, along with a history of 40 years of violence. There is, moments of banality. There are, of course, everyday life and its entire range of emotions. I think for me, this became an important part of the process of writing the book. And everything that I saw, as you said, there were so many things to excavate, to sort of engage with. Slowly, many things revealed themselves slowly. Many things were just sort of there, but I hadn't seen other people be very interested in them. But because as an Indian woman, I related to the city quite differently, and these things sort of resonated with me in a different way. So I went ahead and I explored those parts as well. A lot of this book is about the physical aspects of the city, but I also spent a lot of time just listening to people talk about their memories of Kabul, which I thought was really fascinating. There's also mythology, there's the history of Kabul in literature, and there's also the idea of Kabul in literature of the region. So there was this sense of richness. The longer I spent in the city, it kept emerging layer after layer. When I was eventually writing the book and thinking of a title for it, my editor actually came up with the name Shadow City, and I grew to like it a lot because it has that sense of being ephemeral, of being sort of there and not there. And a shadow is very much something that appears, if you're walking down the street, it sort of travels with you, but it's not really something that you can touch or, you can't really grab a hold of it. But at the same time, it's indisputably there. And I think that was the sense I got from Kabul, was that there are so many layers to the city and you do have to look for them to appear. I think that's why I found the capaciousness of this name quite appealing.
What you say here about conceptual distance is something that I certainly felt when I was reading your book, especially in your discussions of the cinema and the salons. And I remember thinking as I read your book, feeling a bit ashamed that I would be surprised to discover that there is everyday life in Afghanistan. I think from the American perspective, we're bombarded by media accounts of this war zone wasteland with radical insurgents and nothing more. And so it's a bit embarrassing to read this and to be surprised by something that I shouldn't be, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that's a really interesting response, actually. I felt the same, honestly. I mean, I don't know how. And the interesting layer to that for my response was also that India is a lot closer to Afghanistan physically, of course, but also, which is what I discovered over time, was there is also a sense of shared culture, which is so much stronger for the Afghans, they would feel it a lot more. They would talk about it a lot more than I would or people around me in India would. So I think it's not, it would definitely differ, but I think it's quite widespread, the sense of, astonishment that a city like Kabul could be a city, like a place that you might even imagine knowing or might seem familiar to you.
Right. You mentioned in the book that your family is Pashtun, and so you have a somewhat of a connection to the region. And what was very nice about your book is that your grandfather appears throughout your book as kind of like a guide, like kind of like a Virgil from afar, When others question your decision to go to Kabul, he didn't. He seemed to support it, and he seemed to kind of, guide you in terms of the literary history and the literary diversity of his past and your family's past. So wondering if you could, talk to us a little bit about him, your grandfather, and his support and his kind of literary impact.
Yeah, that's such a lovely way of describing him, Jeremy. Thank you. And it's, every time I think about him and the book, it's just extremely emotional because, like you said, he was such a big form. He took such a big role in how the book turned out. My father's side of the family has Pashtun heritage, and this was, it's sort of, it was a small part of how I related to Kabul eventually, because, it was all sort of in the past, and it gave me a way to arrive in Kabul, which was a way of excitement and curiosity, which I think in hindsight, I feel was a good way to enter the city rather than being anxious or apprehensive. And but as you say, my maternal grandfather, Baba, was the person who really, truly guided me when I was there. And a lot of it was because he inhabited this cultural matrix so effortlessly. And he was able to almost intuitively understand what it was like to be in Kabul, though he had never visited. And he actually told me this, that there are certain cities I know really well, even though I've never visited them. And so this strange thing would happen that I would be in Kabul and I would come back to Aligarh, which is where he lived. And I would describe things that I saw there to him. And then he would tell me stories about the things that I had seen. And then, I would sort of be like, oh, okay, that's interesting. And the next time I went, I would take that information with me, and that would grow into something else in Kabul. I would speak to other people, or I would see things or read things. And so he was like a bridge between me and the city, where he never left his room from his study with, purely this sense of intellectual engagement. He was able to connect me to Kabul in a really, really rich way, I think. Because there were so many things that I learned from him that changed the way I related to Kabul. For instance, he told me about a really beautiful love story that's set in Kabul in this Persian epic called the Shahnameh. And the Princess of Kabul is Rudaba, and she falls in love with a visiting warrior prince, and they both have this, and they're both in love with each other without seeing each other, and then eventually they get married. So Baba telling me this story changed the way I saw Kabul, as it became a setting for romance, as a place where you could experience longing and desire and love. And I think that things like this really shifted how I could, what I saw in Kabul, and how I could then make sense of what I was seeing.
That's interesting because as you read the book, it seems that there is kind of like a romance, but with the city, and
that's interesting.
The longing, like the idea of falling in love with a place and finding uncovering the true magic of a place as one experiences it. You've mentioned also that the literature acted sort of as a bridge, and it helped you kind of arrive. And so we have also here the language of movement. And I think you mentioned somewhere in the book that Kabul, the name refers to a bridge.
Yes, one of the legends about how the city got its name is that it used to be a city on a magic island in the middle of a lake. And to get there, the king who built the city, he built a bridge leading to this island. And it was built out of straw, which is ka, and the word for bridge is pul. So the combination of straw and bridge, which is ka and pul, became the name of the city, which is Kabul.
Yeah. And so there's this kind of language of movement. And of course, movement plays very heavily in your book, as the subtitle alludes to. It's a woman walks Kabul, but so does a gender here. So I was wondering if you could maybe speak to what it was like to walk in what I would probably erroneously think of as a war zone. What is it like to walk in Kabul, and what is it like to walk as a woman in Kabul? Just a quick note and we'll get right back to the episode. If you enjoy the podcast, please leave a review on your favorite podcasting app or consider supporting the show with only a few dollars a month at travelwritingworld.com/support.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because, like I said in the book, the idea of walking was a loaded one for me when I arrived. And I was almost one of the first things I was told when I got to Kabul was that I shouldn't walk. And this wasn't because I was a woman. This was because I had come from abroad to work in Kabul. Of course, there were people all around. There was life on the streets. But because I had come from India, I was someone from the outside. I was told that it wasn't safe for me to walk. But because I already had this complicated relationship with being told not to walk as an Indian woman, that landed for me differently. And it also made me feel like this was a city that kind of felt familiar because, I'd already been told not to walk in many places. So I thought, well, maybe this is some place where I can negotiate my path also. So that was, sort of a interesting beginning to this journey. And I think the feeling of walking in Kabul was also a useful one for me to use in the book because it changed pretty much in keeping with how the city changed over the time I was there. So 2006, it was relatively easy. And I'm saying relatively, of course, because this was still never a completely safe city, but it was relatively simpler for me to be able to go out to walk to the bazaar or to walk with my friends around on Friday afternoons. And as time went by, as the security situation started becoming more fraught, it's interesting to note that the response physically and also from the Afghan government and also the international agencies working there was to withdraw from the streets. And I could see that reflected in the geography of Kabul, which was suddenly, half the street would vanish behind these massive concrete barriers. There would be these boom barriers would turn up. There would be sandbags in front of homes. So I could see the city transforming in this very geographical way as well. I would say that the feeling of being on the streets was you had to sort of be prepared. What I learned was that things could change very, very quickly. And, I had to learn to trust the people I was around and to take their advice for whatever they felt was the right thing to do at that time.
You'd mentioned somewhere in the book, which it was really a lovely way to put it. You mentioned that walking is a luxury. And I understand now what you mean in terms of your experience of walking in India as a woman, but also now your experience as walking as a foreigner in Kabul. But it's an interesting inversion, right? Because of the class associations with the idea of walking as a luxury. In the United States, and I assume some other parts of the world, people wouldn't want to be caught walking. Like walking is it's a different thing. It's something that people dislike. I was wondering maybe if you could attempt to answer this. Like, does walking help shape the perception of a city in a different way than I guess other forms of transportation in the city?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question in the sense, for me, I think it's a really important question because, like I said, I already had this very complicated relationship with the idea of walking. And as a woman who grew up in an Indian city in the north of India, it was never okay for me to just be out. And this is a feeling that a lot of women I've spoken with in India resonate with, in the sense that just stepping out of the house, you needed to have a reason to do that. You couldn't inhabit the streets in this very carefree way. You couldn't loiter, which is actually a really interesting book about set in Mumbai, which is called Why Loiter. And it's very gendered. Men can be out on the streets for leisure, for no reason at all. For women, the idea of being out for no reason at all was a very loaded one. So even if you were on the streets very close to your own house, or if I was even in my own hometown, I had to display a reason for inhabiting this space. I had to carry a posture of work or purpose in my gait, in the way I moved my body, or, just I had to sort of signal to people around me that it was okay that I was there. I had a reason for being there. And I think this is what makes me so, this is what makes me so receptive to the idea of walking as a way of exploring spaces, even if it's not a city where this kind of equation works. I find it a really, really precious movement, the ability to go wherever I want, wherever my 2 feet carry me, the feeling of being able to loiter, to wander, to sort of just meander through, it doesn't matter where I end up. I think this is a feeling that I find extremely central to, in the real world, exploring cities, and as a writer, then making sense of what I see. I find very often that when I'm writing, I feel if I'm putting two images together, they're adding up slightly differently. And if I can take, a slightly sideways look at these two images, it tells you a larger story, I feel. If you sort of let go of the idea of linearity, if you can let go of the idea of, I don't know if I'm making sense, but I mean, what I'm trying to say is that I think that there is a sense of richness to the idea of being able to go off the beaten path and to be able to explore, in which walking gives you. And I think that is what I tap into a lot when I'm writing.
Yeah, no, definitely when you read the book, you don't get the sense that you're just walking from point A to point B in the city, but it's more of like a kind of organic or a concentric circle type exploration, where you venture into the public and into the private spaces, right? From graveyards into, very intimate situations with women in salons and marriage parties. So these concentric circles of spaces here in which you walk, I think, is what gives this book a lot of depth and kind of resonance that someone else who perhaps isn't a woman or isn't a foreigner might not have access to, which I think is a very interesting element here.
Yeah, I think it took a little bit of time also to, just as a writer, to as a woman, to also see the value in this kind of meandering and in these kind of paths, because Kabul is such a densely engraved terrain. It seemed almost, it seemed to make, like almost like common sense to go through a certain kind of checklist of issues to write about. And, and there was also so much being written about the city, and there was so much going on about Kabul at that time that at one point I had to think about, is this a book about current affairs? And once I could say, no, it's not, is when I could focus on going to all into all the spaces that I really enjoyed and I found interesting, and seeing the value in that, because I feel that's also a journey for a woman writer to take. Especially as an Indian woman writer, I had to trust the fact that there was value in these stories and in my being able to inhabit these stories and to telling these stories to readers. I think that was also a journey that even while I was writing the book, I was undertaking.
Can you tell us a little bit about that journey? I mean, when did it come together in your mind that you knew you had, a series of stories to tell that other people weren't telling?
I think around 2000. I mean, it's hard for me actually, Jeremy, to put a date to it, but I do remember feeling quite strongly the longer time I spent in Kabul, like I said, that it wasn't satisfying to be able to write just news or even write news features. And I think around 2011, when I was spending weeks and weeks all together in the city, and I could see sort of things shifting around me, I was very keen to capture a sense of that feeling. And I think once I had the idea of writing a book, the biggest challenge I had was finding a structure that could accommodate this sense of exploration, and that could also allow the reader then to also fill in the silences with their own imagination. Like you said, that can we imagine this as a city which might be familiar? I mean, would there be a moment when the reader could see an image of Kabul or just have a scene described to him or her about something that's happening and feel, oh, that sounds familiar? So I think this was the longest and the hardest part of the writing for me, which probably began after 2013, which was when I stopped going to Kabul and started, inhabiting the manuscript really, really deeply. And I took a lot of time. I wrote several drafts of the book until I could get to the structure, which I felt was a good balance between me telling a story and the reader then being able to take that story and make what they wanted of it. I also had to find a balance between myself in the book, because I was quite clear that I didn't want it to be a memoir, in the sense that I didn't want it to be the story of a journalist going to a place and talking about what happens to him or her, because I felt there have been a lot of stories like that, but not so many about the city itself. And I was quite clear that I wanted this to be a book where Kabul was the central character.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was going to mention, or I was going to ask you about the memoir question, because it's easy to characterize a travel book as sort of like a memoir, but I think like the memoir the central kind of, I guess, struggle in a memoir would be some sort of psychodrama, of the individual. Yeah. But this one, if it is a memoir, it's one that, and I'm not sure it is, I'm not calling it, but if it is a memoir, it's one that focuses on Kabul as the protagonist, which is interesting. You're in it, but it's not about you, as a memoir would be.
Yes, exactly. I think that was key for me, was that I had no sort of compulsive need to cut myself out of the story. I'm quite okay with sharing with the readers that this is my viewpoint, this is what I feel. And also I thought by being there, I could open up the story in the sense that I could make the connections between myself and Aligarh, between India, between my own memories and what I was seeing in Kabul. The central question, I think, which I used when deciding where I should be on the page and where I shouldn't, is whether my voice was opening up a different vista of Kabul for the reader. Mm-hmm. And that was the functionality of my being on the page. Like you said, mostly I would agree with you that it's not a traditional memoir. I mean, I hope that's how it's turned out to be. Of course, every reader reads the book differently, and it's now has a life of its own, and I can't really decide how it goes down. But I feel in a traditional memoir, there would be some kind of internal journey of the narrator that we tend to track. And in this case, that character, the protagonist, is the city.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. In light of what you're saying about traditional narratives, or not traditional narratives, but post 2001 narratives of Afghanistan and the city, I was wondering if you encountered any roadblocks in proposing or publishing a story that has or tells a different type of story of Afghanistan, one that's not kind of like war reportage or related to war or anything like that. I mean, directly related to the struggle and tensions of war,
Yeah, that's a really perceptive question. And I think I learned a lot about how publishing works through the process of writing this book. I think initially there was an expectation that this writing about Afghanistan, as I said, would go through a series of issues. Mm-hmm. And the fact that this wasn't a book that sought to do that was definitely a challenge, at least in the initial stages. And I think the fact that I was drawing on different devices to build the book was also a little bit of a challenge initially for people to support. I think for that reason, I took a long time to build it myself before I even pitched it. And I waited until I was quite confident that I could carry the structure through the book. And from that point on, I feel I was very fortunate in finding an agent who believed in the vision I had for the book, and then eventually an editor and a publishing house that was behind this. But I think in the initial stages, I felt quite clearly the expectation that this would be either a memoir about a woman being in Kabul, or it would be a story, a bunch of portraits of the so-called hot button issues of Kabul, and that would have been very, very boring for me to write, I think, because it's just I was already tired of doing that for news, and there's also this. I think for that reason, I could just take the risk because it didn't, if there's one less book about Afghanistan, so what? There were already so many, and so many good books as well. There've been some really, really excellent reportage. There's been some fantastic documentary films made. So I could sort of give myself a pass in the sense, well, even if your book doesn't get published, that's fine, as long as you write it the way you want to write it.
And I think the risk paid off because you have here a unique and very beautiful and rich and deep book. I was wondering if you could close us off by perhaps reading a short passage from your book.
Sure. Thank you so much for your deep reading, Jeremy. I'm so grateful to you for your insights about this book. Every conversation I have with a reader is really like a gift. And I think during the writing process, I was so focused on the text on the page that I didn't realize how wonderful this part of the process could be as well. Just having conversations with people who read the book, who have their own sort of relationship with the city. So I'm really grateful to you for having me on your show and also for your really interesting and insightful questions. I'm going to read from the first chapter. It's called Returns. Stories in Kabul begin with the phrase, Yeki Bood, Yeki Nabood. There was one, there was no one. The phrase corresponds to the once upon a time of fairy tales elsewhere. Whichever way you choose to read this expression, it is a good place to begin this story of Kabul, a city that was and never was. Or to use the trick of fables, there it is not. The story of Kabul begins with bridges, roads appearing on water. In one legend about its origin, it appeared as a magic island in the middle of a large lake. To reach the island, a king built a bridge or a pull made of straw or kah. The combination of the two words that created this bridge, kah and pull, gave the city he made on this magic isle its name. Kabul is an island, or so it appears to the outsider standing on one of its nondescript potholed streets. It deceives you with its high walls streaked with brown mud, punctuated by steel-topped gates. It hides behind the fine mist of dust that hangs over its streets and homes, so that the city appears as though from the other side of a soft curtain, like a mirage, a place that is both near and far away. But walk through the small opening in an entrance gate, and everything changes. You enter lush gardens and beautiful homes, their rooms filled with books, carpets, photographs, and music. In the older quarters of the city, the flat mud roofs of the tightly packed homes form a different kind of thoroughfare, an elevated path across secluded spaces that is protected from the public gaze. Elsewhere, there appear landscapes of homes clinging to the hills, their windows half reflecting the sky, half revealing glimpses of life in the rooms within. The city appears with a shift in perspective. As a child, I was fascinated by a tiny kaleidoscope my father bought me. It was a plastic tube with a transparent cap at the end, filled with pieces of broken bangles, colored glass of different sizes. I was riveted by this transformation of everyday objects into the fragments of a magical landscape. And I was drawn to how a simple shift of my wrist, or even of my eye, would make the pieces rearrange themselves into a new picture. Walking in Kabul is like looking through the kaleidoscope. Fragments fall into place, the familiar appears new. There it is not. Kabul appears where you don't expect to see it.
Thank you. It's very beautiful.
Thank you very much, Jeremy.
Where could we find you online?
I mostly now live on Instagram.
Okay.
My handle is _Taran Khan. And I also have my work on portfolio.net/Taran.
Okay, great. We'll put those links in the show notes. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. It was really great talking to you.
You can find the episode show notes and much more at travelwritingworld.com. please remember to subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast app. And if you find the show valuable, please consider leaving a review or supporting the show with only a few dollars a month at travelwritingworld.com/support.